Watchmen Chapter 4 is titled Watchmaker. This title has multiple meanings, as do many elements of the graphic novel. The first meaning is a reference to Dr. Manhattan's father, who was a watchmaker. With his father's influence, John graduated from Princeton University with a Ph.D. in atomic physics. The second meaning references the argument from design by William Paley. This concept, discussed in the book Natural Theory, states that with the complexity of the universe, there must be a creator. Paley used the example of finding a watch that's complexity implied to some higher creator. The chapter is focused around Dr. Manhattan's life, and so the concept of a higher being in charge of creation is very fitting. Before discussing the small details of this chapter, I'm going to, as briefly as I can, summarize its entirety. The chapter begins with Dr. Manhattan on Mars, as he reflects on the most major turning points in his life. As a child, his father, a watchmaker, was deeply affected by the bombing of Hiroshima and pushed John to become a scientist. John attended Princeton, which led to his employment by a research lab at Gila Flats in 1959, where he met and eventually fell in love with Janie Slater. At a fair, a fat man steps on Janie's watch and John uses his watchmaking skills to fix it. Unfortunately, he left the watch in his lab coat pocket, and when he went to retrieve it, he accidentally time-locked himself into a test vault meant to remove the intrinsic field of the cell. He at first was disintegrated, but after about a month, ghosts of his circulatory system, muscles, etc. began appearing in the area. Finally, he appeared as a complete blue being with superpowers. He retained his memories in relative physical form, but was no longer able to connect on a human level. He was recruited as a military asset of the USA and given a new name, Dr. Manhattan. He changed the course of American history as he helped them win the Vietnam War. His presence also aided in the disbandment of the costume vigilantes. One of the most used pieces of imagery in this chapter is a photo taken of Janie Slater and John at a fair in July 1959. This is the only picture of John in his human form. The photograph makes several different appearances throughout the chapter, either on walls, in John's hands, or, for the most part, in the sands of Mars. The picture makes its first appearance as the cover image of the chapter. Its frequent appearances show the picture in coinciding moments importance in Dr. Manhattan's timeline, as he repeatedly goes back to the picture on Mars' surface while telling his story. The fair the picture was taken at was the one in which Janie's watch was stepped on, which led to him trying to fix it and, in the end, changing into Dr. Manhattan. On screen is a list of every appearance of this picture in the chapter. A large portion of the imagery and dialogue in Chapter 4 is about scientific and cultural references. On page 5, frame 4, writing on the bulletin board says, "At play amidst the strangeness and charm," which is a reference to the two properties of quarks, which are the tiny particles that make up protons and neutrons. On page 9, frame 3 makes a quick reference about Elvis Presley. On page 12, frame 6 shows John creating a symbol on his head meant to resemble a hydrogen atom. In frame 7, the name Dr. Manhattan relates to the Manhattan Project, a research and development undertaking during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapon. Lastly, on page 14, frame 2 shows a crime den named Dante's, in reference to the Divine Comedy, a long narrative poem written by Italian writer Dante Alighieri. The poem is a narrative of an imaginary journey through the three realms of the afterlife: Inferno, Hell, Purgatorio, Purgatory, and Paradiso, Heaven. The red lighting inside the crime den is meant to mimic a hell-like atmosphere. The creation of Dr. Manhattan is one of the most pivotal moments in the novel, as it is the start of many of the major technological changes and diversions from our regular timeline. First, on page 15, in frame 6, John talks about how his ability to produce lithium, the material needed to produce car batteries, out of thin air means that electric cars will soon be more accessible to the public. This fact is followed up within frame 7, with the subtle note that Kennedy was shot in an electric limousine. The fact that John refuses to stop certain events, like Kennedy's death, shock other characters throughout the graphic novel. Throughout this chapter, We see the destruction of Janie and John's relationship and the formation of John and Laurie's. On page 16, in frame 8, John gives Janie a pair of seemingly magnetic earrings in an attempt to lessen her anger towards him. If looking closely, you can see Laurie wearing the same pair of earrings in frame 3 of page 12. In most normal relationships, a gift like that would not be re-given, showing John's loss of human morals. On page 21, the announcement is made in frame 1 that this 22nd Amendment is repealed, allowing presidents to stay in office for more than 2 terms. In frames 3 and 4, the genetically altered links and possibility of new, safe modes of air travel show how much technology had advanced after Dr. Manhattan's appearance. The word safe is important in this, as in 1937, a large blimp called the Hindenburg crashed, killing 37 of its passengers. Page 22 shows the beginning of the downfall of the hooded vigilantes as a crowd of rioters surround the White House fighting for the banning of the costumed heroes. The result is on page 23 in frame 1 with the passing of the Keene Act to ban these hooded vigilantes. In frame 3, the comedian is seen fixing the Iranian hostage crisis, leaving him and Dr. Manhattan as the only legal heroes left. Frame 4 on page 24 shows the culmination of Dr. Manhattan's effect on society, with a shot of the city looking much like it does in their present day. There's a Gunga diner in the background, and meltdowns and nostalgia ads, a 4 more years sign, an issue of the New Frontiersman, airships in the background, a man with a ball pipe, and a white hat that seems to have vents on the side. These small details show just how much the city changed in a short period of time. Lastly, there are some other allusions, references, and small details the artist and writer included that didn't quite fit into the previous 2 categories. On page 1, in frame 2, we get the first acknowledgement of Dr. Manhattan's unique sense of time. He experiences the past, present, and future all at the same time. On page 5, frames 1 and 2 show an interesting comparison between the bestiary, when it was new, versus how it looks abandoned and broken down. On page 17, frame 1 shows the first and only Crime Busters meeting. Also in this frame, John announces he will no longer be wearing most of his costume. John, unlike the other vigilantes, doesn't need to hide behind a mask to make changes in the world. To him, the costume seems silly and juvenile. In frame 4 on page 19, you can see the woman the comedian eventually gets pregnant and kills happily by his arm. In frame 6 on the same page, a splash of either sweat or spit falls on the smiley face pinned to the comedian's shirt, alluding at the typical blood-smeared presence of the smiley face. Lastly, on page 24 in frame 7, the clock is stopped in the same spot Janie's was when it was broken, steadily tying together the 2 events' effect on John. As with every chapter of Watchmen, Chapter 4 ends with a quote in which the title of the chapter is derived from. In Chapter 4, Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, "The release of atom power has changed everything except our way of thinking. The solution to this problem lies in the heart of mankind. If only I had known, I should have become a watchmaker." This quote discusses quantum mechanics destroying any view of our universe as deterministic, or the view that all events are destined to happen no matter what. This concept greatly contrasts with Dr. Manhattan's sense of time, which appears to be deterministic. The attached document to this chapter is a summary of Dr. Manhattan's strategic importance, titled Dr. Manhattan, Superpowers and the Superpowers, by Milton Glass, who directed the Gila Flats Institute. Overall, the purpose of this chapter was to give a sense of how drastically different the world was before and after the existence of Dr. Manhattan.